they call Rome the Eternal City. But that eternity came at a price. A million people once lived here, the largest city on Earth. And then it nearly died. From 1 million down to 30,000. Wolves roamed the hills. Cattle grazed in the great square where an empire's fate had once been decided. The city was burned, sacked, abandoned, stripped for its stone, yet every time it rebuilt itself on the same hills. Today, nearly 3 million people live here again. Back in the 8th century, the monk Bede recorded what pilgrims said: "While the Colosseum stands, Rome stands. When Rome falls, the world falls." Well, the Colosseum is still standing. This is the story of a city that refuses to die. And to understand how, we have to go back to the very beginning. For a long time, early Rome could only be imagined from ruins and old drawings. Now, using AI trained on historical imagery, we can see the city much as it once was. The marble forums of the empire, a pasture on the site of the forum, Baroque piazzas on opening day. 2,500 years of a city's life. Let's begin. It all began with a river crossing. Here, the Tiber makes a sharp bend, and right in that bend lies an island, the only place for miles where the river can be forded. Hills rose above the crossing, and between them lay a marshy, unhealthy hollow that the runoff from the slopes turned to bog. People settled on these hills very early. Traces of them go back to the Bronze Age, but it wasn't a city yet. Each hill held its own separate village. They lived on the dry summits and built from whatever lay underfoot. From Capellaccio, a crumbly tuff quarried straight off the Palatine and the Capitoline. Even then, a division appeared that the city would carry through its whole history. The hills were dry, clean, expensive. The rich lived there. The valleys stayed cramped and filthy. The air up top, Romans like to joke, cost more. Of those first people we know little, they left no writing. But the legend of the city's birth, Romans told gladly. According to it, the city was founded by twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, who fell out over who should rule. As Romulus was marking the boundary and laying the first wall, Remus leapt over it in mockery, and Romulus killed him on the spot with the words, "So perish anyone who leaps over my walls." The city barely existed yet, and its founding legend already held a murdered brother, and that Romans never forgot about themselves. So, by tradition, in 753 BC, Romulus founded the city and gave it his name. There weren't enough people, so he declared it a refuge. Runaways and outlaws streamed in from all around, and the women they took by force, seizing the daughters of a neighboring people in the middle of a festival. After Romulus, kings ruled the city for nearly 2.5 centuries, 7 of them, one after another, and it was under them that the scatter of villages on the hills finally grew into a single city. The decisive work was done by the last kings, the Etruscan Tarquins. It was they who tackled that marshy hollow between the hills, draining it with an enormous covered channel, the Cloaca Maxima. The water drained away, and on the dry ground that opened up came a shared space for all the hills, the Forum, the future heart of Rome. In effect, the separate villages fused into a city the moment that bog was drained, and the cloaca was never abandoned. It still works today, and you can see where it empties into the Tiber by the broken bridge, the Ponte Ratto. Around the same time, the kings raised the first temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline and held the first census. But the last of the Tarquins ruled as a tyrant, and in 509 BC the Romans drove him out, swearing they would never again have a king. So the Republic was born, and with it began the first great rebuilding of the city. The Republic grew on war, and the city grew with it, built quite literally from the stone of the conquered. The first thing they did to the city was wall it. After the Gauls sacked Rome in 387 BC, the Romans for the first time ringed the 7 hills with a real fortification, the Servian Wall. And the stone for it came from the quarries of Veii, the Etruscan city they had just conquered, a yellow-gray tuff, tougher than the old Capellaccio. The city had begun to rebuild itself from the spoils of its own wars. Those Servian stones never vanished. Chunks of the wall still jut out today, embedded in later masonry on the Capitoline. Next, the city pulled in water and roads, again paid for by victory. In 3112 BC, the censor Appius Claudius built Rome's first aqueduct, the Aqua Appia, 10 miles, almost entirely underground. The same year, Rome's first great paved road struck out to the south, the Appian Way. The principle was the same for both, straight, hard, built to last. And then came a technology that would change building itself for thousands of years to come: concrete. In the 2nd century BC, the Romans began mixing volcanic ash with lime and got a material that set even underwater and let them pour vaults and arches of any size. The first known concrete buildings were temples in the Forum around 120 BC. From that moment, Rome could build not only what could be cut from stone, but almost anything it could imagine. But the city grew without a plan. The streets stayed narrow. Even the main ones, the Sacred Way and the New Way, were no wider than 20 feet. Most people were packed into the valleys, above all into the Subura, a cramped quarter of shops, taverns, and tenements, dark and loud. And above it, on the Palatine, the nobility still lived. The same gap between hilltop and valley as under the kings, only sharper now. By the end of the Republic, the city held more than 500,000 people, and the local fields could no longer feed them. Grain came by sea from abroad. Rome was now dependent on shipments and on its aqueducts, and that dependence drove it to conquer ever further. And those wars bred generals, with armies loyal to them personally. The first to march troops across the city's sacred boundary was Sulla. Caesar finished the job crossing the little border river, the Rubicon, in 49 BC. After his murder came 13 years of civil war, and out of it stepped a single victor. From the Republic, the Forum still stands today, with its Sacred Way and the Mamertine prison at the foot of the Capitoline. In 5 centuries, the Republic built the city's skeleton, out of stone and concrete. As for what that skeleton would be dressed in, the first emperor would say it himself. The man who came out of those civil wars was called Octavian. He took the name Augustus and became the first emperor. Of himself he said, simply, that he had found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. And that was barely an exaggeration. Under Augustus and those after him, the city was built up on a scale never seen before, and now it was clad in stone from across the empire. A new technique appeared, a concrete core faced with marble, so a cheap, strong body got an expensive skin. Granite for columns was hauled from the Egyptian desert, marble from Greece and Africa. Above the Temple of Jupiter glinted gilded roof tiles. And here the city reached 1 million people, the largest on Earth, a size no city would match again for 1,500 years. The built-up area covered some 8 square miles, but a huge share of that space was eaten up by public buildings, forums, temples, circuses, baths, imperial gardens. There was nowhere for 1 million people to live. So the city went up. This is how the insulae appeared, apartment blocks up to 6 stories high above the narrow lanes. And here you can see exactly how this city worked, right up the floors of an insula, only the reverse of our own time. Down below, where there was light and running water, were the spacious, expensive apartments and shops. The higher you went, the tighter, darker, and more dangerous it got. The poor crammed into the upper floors, hauling water up by the bucket. Their windows covered not with glass but with oiled cloth. The buildings forever catching fire from the portable braziers. And all of it within a stone's throw of the gilded tiles of the Capitoline. The city was not split into rich and poor districts. Luxury and slum stood pressed together, just at different heights. And this million was fed from across the world. Everything the empire produced poured into Rome. Grain from Egypt and Africa, olive oil from Spain, wine from Gaul, fish sauce from Portugal, spices that had crossed half the globe. Ships unloaded at the ports down the Tiber, and the goods were barged up to the city. You can still touch the trace of that flood today. On the edge of Rome stands a hill called Monte Testaccio, as tall as an 8-story building made entirely of broken clay jars, the amphorae that carried oil into the city for centuries. A 50-meter hill of rubbish, simply from feeding 1 million people every single day. Cheap or free bread for the poor became a matter of state. A hungry mob was more dangerous than any enemy at the gates. Water for that million came from the aqueducts, Rome's great engineering pride. By the early 2nd century, there were about a dozen of them, bringing over 200 million gallons of water into the city every day, feeding the baths, 1,300 fountains, and the flushing public latrines. Across the plain, their arches marched toward the city, man-made rivers on stone legs. And in AD 64 came a fire that gave Rome the chance to rebuild itself properly, and showed who really owned the city. The flames ran for 6 days and burned 2/3 of Rome. The Emperor Nero, clearing the gutted center, dreamed of a new Rome, wide avenues, houses on a human scale, stone facades with porticos against sun and rain. The plan was sound, but half the cleared land in the very heart of the city, Nero took for himself, for a vast private palace with parkland and an artificial lake. He never really finished rebuilding, and many streets stayed as narrow and crooked as before. Still, the new rules after the fire demanded stone instead of timber, and Rome slowly grew less flammable. And when Nero was overthrown, the next emperors made a move that holds the whole character of this city. They tore down the hated palace, drained the private lake, and on that very spot, taken from a tyrant and given back to the people, they built the most famous amphitheater in history, the Colosseum, an oval nearly 200 meters long, 4 tiers, 57 meters high, 76 numbered entrances, 50,000 seats, faced in travertine, with statues in its arches. Where one man had kept a lake for his pleasure, a building rose for the whole city. And the summit of Roman engineering genius was the Pantheon, rebuilt around AD 125. Its concrete dome is 43 meters across, nearly a meter wider than the Dome of St. Peter's, which would be raised 14 centuries later. Inside that dome, a perfect sphere would fit. The temple is exactly as tall as it is wide. At the top, a single round opening, the oculus, the only source of light. This record, the largest concrete dome on Earth, the Pantheon would hold for 1,300 years. And it survives because, from the 7th century, it became a church. Otherwise, it too would have been torn apart. By the early 2nd century, Rome stood at its peak. The sky above it ruled by the arches of the aqueducts and Trajan's column with its ribbon of 2,000 carved figures. It seemed it would last forever. But a city fed and watered from faraway lives only as long as the vast machine that serves it keeps running. And that machine was about to grind to a halt. The city's decline reads most clearly in a single structure, a wall. For 800 years, imperial Rome had no continuous city wall. The old Servian one had long since dissolved into the buildings, and no new one was made. No enemy was ever let anywhere near the capital. The city was so sure of itself that it stood open. And then, in the 270s, it was hastily ringed with an enormous wall, the Aurelian Wall, over 19 kilometers, 381 towers, mighty gates. The very act of building it was an admission of defeat. Rome no longer felt safe. And one chilling detail, the wall enclosed more ground than the city actually filled. It was built with room to spare, while the city inside had already begun to shrink. 2/3 of that wall still stands today, and you can walk its length. Inside, the last giants were still being finished, the colossal baths of Caracalla and Diocletian, with halls 70 meters long and pools for thousands. But these were the last great monuments. After them, large-scale building in Rome simply stops. The machine that fed and watered 1 million began to break down. There was no one left to clean the aqueducts or bring in the grain. Power and money had drained to the frontiers. The capital was moved, first to Milan and Ravenna, then east altogether to Constantinople. And then came what had not happened in 800 years. At dawn on the 24th of August, 410, the Goths under Alaric entered Rome. Someone had opened the gates from within, and for 3 days they sacked the city the whole world had thought untakeable. For those who lived through it, this was the end of the world, quite literally. In Bethlehem, thousands of miles away, St. Jerome heard the news, set down his pen, and could not work. "The city that took the whole world has itself been taken," he wrote, and confessed that sobs choked his words. If Rome could fall, what could possibly stand? To those people, the city was not just a city, but the very word for the order of things. And now it had been sacked for 3 days. But it was not the sack that killed the city so much as what came after. In 476, the last Western emperor was deposed, a boy who by bitter irony was named Romulus Augustulus. In one name, the city's founder and its first emperor both. The Western Empire was no more, and Rome began to do the thing that shows the true depth of its fall. It started to eat itself. With no one quarrying or hauling new stone, they tore it from the old buildings. The Colosseum, the baths, the temples became quarries. By the year 700, the city built for 1 million held 30,000 people. 97 of every 100 gone. The enormous baths, where thousands had once bathed at once, stood empty. People lived alone in houses built for crowds. A whole imperial city was now home to a handful of people, like children playing in an abandoned palace. And it was Rome like this, almost empty, its ruins overgrown, that the pilgrims saw, whose words the monk Bede wrote down. And still, they kept coming. Now picture what the loss of almost an entire population does to a city. The Aurelian Wall, built for a vast Rome, now embraced emptiness. Inside it, between the few inhabited quarters and the walls, lay a great abandoned space. It even had a name, the disabitato. The uninhabited, fields, vineyards, farms, pasture, and ruins. Inside the city walls, whole districts grew over until they looked like dense forest. Foxes and boar lived in the thickets, and wolves roamed the hills. And the Forum, the heart of ancient Rome, became a livestock pasture. They called it just that, the Campo Vacchino, the cow field. The great buildings were too huge to demolish and too solid to fall, so people simply moved into them. And here the defining trick of medieval Rome is born. The city builds itself out of itself. The tomb of the Emperor Hadrian was turned into a fortress, today's Castel Sant'Angelo on the bank of the Tiber. The theater of Marcellus became the castle of a noble family, who built their home straight on top of the ancient arches. And the Colosseum was dismantled methodically, generation after generation. Its travertine and marble were carried off into churches, palaces, and fortresses all over the city. It got to the point where almost every medieval building in Rome holds a stone that was once part of something ancient. The city devoured its own past to build its present. What kept this half-dead city alive was the bones of saints. The apostles Peter and Paul were buried in Rome. Here were the catacombs of the martyrs. When secular power collapsed, its place was taken by the Pope, head of Western Christianity, and pilgrims streamed toward the apostles' tombs from all over Europe. They left their money in the city, and in Jubilee years 5,000 of them came a day. Chroniclers wrote of people crushed to death in the press on the bridges over the Tiber. This is what the city lived on. There was even a moment when the popes themselves abandoned Rome. For 70 years they moved to Avignon, in France, and the city sank lower still. But the pilgrims came anyway, because the bones of the apostles were still here. And when the popes returned and surveyed the overgrown, impoverished city with its cattle grazing in the Forum, they made the decision that would begin Rome's second birth. The city must be great again, worthy of the power the church laid claim to. So began the most dazzling building century in Rome's history. And here something almost unbelievable happens. To build anew, Rome goes to school at its own ruins. When the new St. Peter's was planned, the architect Bramante climbed into the ancient buildings to study how they had held up their vaults and domes. He literally took apart the engineering of the Pantheon to recover the long-lost secret of Roman concrete. The old Basilica of St. Peter, which had stood for 1,000 years, was pulled down, and on its site they began to raise the greatest church in Christendom. The work stretched over nearly 120 years. Bramante, Raphael, Michelangelo, and later Bernini worked on it one after another. Michelangelo designed the dome. It was raised to 42 meters across, and still could not surpass the Pantheon, whose dome had been built 14 centuries earlier and remained a touch wider. Ancient Rome still held the record. That same Michelangelo painted the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, nearly 300 square meters, 4 years' work beneath the vault. The city was filling again with marble and paint, as it had under the emperors. The money for all this came from the sale of indulgences across Europe. Pay the church, and your sins are forgiven. But that same trade in forgiveness outraged a German monk named Martin Luther, and out of his protest grew the schism that split Western Christianity in two. It was almost a mockery. The city paid for its rebirth in stone by the very means that tore half its faithful away. And then the schism came back with an army. In 1527, the troops of the Emperor Charles V, a Catholic ruler no less, mutinied over unpaid wages and sacked Rome. The Pope hid in Castel Sant'Angelo, having fled there along the covered passage from the Vatican, the very passage tourists are shown today. Plague followed the sack, and in a single year, the city emptied from 80,000 people to 30. Contemporaries wrote that it was worse than the barbarian invasion 1,000 years before. But Rome, as ever, rose again, and the popes who came next would set about reshaping not single buildings, but the whole city at once. At the end of the 16th century, Pope Sixtus V did something no one had done since the days of the empire. He set out to rebuild not the buildings, but the very plan of the city. By then, Rome was a maze of crooked medieval lanes in which a pilgrim simply got lost. Sixtus cut straight, long avenues through that maze, linking the major churches so a pilgrim could walk from shrine to shrine in a straight line. At the crossings, he set Egyptian obelisks, the very ones the emperors had once hauled to Rome. As tall landmarks, see an obelisk from afar, and you know which way to go. And he did something the city had not seen in 1,000 years. He brought back real water. He restored an ancient aqueduct and sent new fountains running through the city. After 8 centuries of drinking from wells, water sang in the squares of Rome again. And on this foundation rose Baroque Rome, the city as one continuous piece of theater. Its master was Gian Lorenzo Bernini. The famous fountain in the Piazza Navona he crowned with a genuine ancient Egyptian obelisk. Again, a piece of ancient Rome set into the new. And before St. Peter's, Bernini threw out his colossal oval colonnade, over 300 meters long, 284 columns, 140 statues of saints along the top, embracing a square the size of the whole Colosseum. This Rome of domes, piazzas, obelisks, and fountains is the Rome we still see on the postcards. But behind that magnificent facade stood a very different city. In those very years, the Colosseum was heaped with dung and used to pen livestock. An English traveler in 1765 recorded with astonishment that Rome's greatest monument was being rented out as a stable. The city lived on pilgrims, artists, and the papal treasury. No industry, no trade, no army. A magnificent stage set with poverty and filth behind it. And so Rome met the 19th century, a museum city living off its past. And then a modern nation arrived and decided to make that museum its capital. In 1870, Italian troops blew a breach in the Aurelian Wall by the Porta Pia, that same wall, 1,500 years old, and took Rome. For the first time since antiquity, it was a capital again, and the last, most furious building boom in its history began. At first, the city was utterly unready for the role. When the new government needed to house its officials, it asked for 40,000 rooms, and the city could offer 500. So they built as Rome had never built. Districts spread out from the center in every direction, swallowing the old villas and gardens. Peasants poured in from all over Italy for the building work, whole families. They were seen sleeping on the steps of churches and under arches, while a stone's throw away officials sipped aperitifs in the smart, new cafes. The population leapt from 200,000 in 1870 to nearly 500,000 by the century's end, and then the building bubble burst, and in a single year, the number of houses under construction fell 15-fold. The symbol of the new Rome was the giant white monument to King Victor Emmanuel, 150 meters long, 60 high, of a glaring white marble that, with its sheer brightness, drowns out the soft grays and browns and oranges of the old city. Romans promptly nicknamed it the Sugar Mountain, and later British soldiers called it the Wedding Cake. For the first time in the city's whole history, a new building did not grow out of Rome. It argued with it, and in the 1920s came Mussolini, who also set about recutting the city, but with a particular design. He dreamed of a third Rome and drove a wide ceremonial avenue straight through the heart of the ancient city. And beneath the asphalt of that avenue, the ancient buildings still lie, never excavated. He tore down medieval quarters and dug out ancient ruins. That archaeological park with the Forum and the Palatine, where tourists walk today, is largely his doing. The logic was simple: make ancient Rome visible, the better to declare himself its heir. The irony ran three ways. He was destroying the Middle Ages for the sake of antiquity, for the sake of his own future. And beneath all these layers, the city keeps its defining quirk. Because of the 25 centuries lying in the ground, Rome still has one of the most modest subway systems of any great European city. Dig anywhere, and you strike antiquity, and the work stops for years. The modern city literally cannot move without running into its own past. Look at the walls of the Colosseum. They are pocked all over, hundreds of holes, top to bottom. Each hole marks where an iron clamp was once levered out and melted down. In the 8th century, the 9th, the 10th, the marble was stripped for churches. The stone was carted off to palaces and fortresses. What's left is a travertine skeleton and holes where everything else was carried away into other buildings of this same city. And that is Rome entire. The Servian wall was built from the stone of a conquered city. Medieval fortresses rose inside ancient theaters. The dome of St. Peter's was studied from the Pantheon. The colonnade in St. Peter's Square was raised from the same travertine as the Colosseum. For 2,500 years, the city built itself out of itself, taking the old apart and laying it up as something new, layer upon layer. 1 million. Then 30,000, then 3 million. The Forum was a cattle pasture. The Colosseum was a stable. Wolves walked the hills, and every time the city rose again, out of its own stones. That is why, beneath today's streets, all the earlier Romes still lie, one upon another. The Baroque on the medieval on the imperial on that first village by the ford. Dig, and you find them all. The Tiber still flows past the same 7 hills. While the Colosseum stands, Rome stands. It stands.